It is June 14th, 1998, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Delta Center is shaking with noise, with sweat, with the compressed weight of 20,000 people who have spent their whole lives watching basketball, but have never seen anything quite like this. The Chicago Bulls trail the Utah Jazz by 1 point. 18 seconds remain on the clock. The fate of the sixth championship, the dynasty, the legacy, all of it hangs in the air like the final note of a symphony that has been building for 15 years. Michael Jordan receives the ball on the right wing. His defender, Brian Russell, is in front of him. The crowd is deafening. Jordan drives left, and then, in a single motion so practiced, it has become something closer to instinct than intention. He plants his right foot, pushes off, and rises. Russell falls away. Jordan hangs in the air, that impossible, gravity-defying hang, releases the ball with a flick of the wrist, and watches it arc toward the basket. It goes in. Chicago leads by 1. The Jazz fail to score. The buzzer sounds. Michael Jordan stands at the center of the Delta Center floor with his fist raised, tears streaming down his face, and the world understands it has just watched something it will spend the next 3 decades trying to describe. He is the greatest basketball player who ever lived. And this is the story of how he became that. This is the story of every rejection, every tragedy, every obsessive hour in an empty gymnasium that built the man the world came to know as simply Michael. Welcome to Visionary Chronicles. Before the 6 championships, before the Air Jordan empire worth more than $5 billion a year, before the documentary that stopped the world in the spring of 2020, there was a 15-year-old boy in Wilmington, North Carolina, who was told he was not good enough. He was cut from the varsity basketball team at Laney High School. He went home and cried behind a closed door, alone with his humiliation. And in that moment, in that specific sting, something was ignited inside him that would never go out. There was a father murdered on a roadside in North Carolina, and a son so undone by grief that he walked away from the thing he loved most. There was a minor league baseball diamond in Birmingham, Alabama, where a man who had won 3 championships chose to face curveballs rather than confront a world that no longer contained his best friend. There was a comeback. There was a second dynasty. There was a final shot in Salt Lake City. But before any of it, before the legend calcified into myth, there was a boy, a ball, and a hunger that nothing in the world was ever quite able to satisfy. Tonight we trace it all, every chapter, every turn, because the story of Michael Jeffrey Jordan is not simply the story of a basketball player. It is the story of what a human being can become when they choose to let their pain drive them forward rather than hold them back. Michael Jeffrey Jordan was born on February 17, 1963, in Cumberland Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. He was the 4th of 5 children born to James Raymond Jordan and Deloris Peoples Jordan, a couple from North Carolina who had come north for work and would eventually return home, carrying their family with them, back to the red clay and the slow rivers and the particular texture of the American South. James Jordan worked at a General Electric plant. Deloris worked in banking. They were not wealthy people, but they were disciplined, principled, and deeply invested in their children. James was a man who loved to tinker with engines, who could fix almost anything mechanical, who saw in the physical world a kind of logic he could impose his will upon. Deloris was the organizational mind of the household, structured, demanding, unafraid to hold her children to standards they sometimes thought unreasonable. Between the two of them, they created a home where excellence was not an aspiration, It was a baseline. When Michael was still small, the family returned to Wilmington, North Carolina, settling into a house on Gordon Road. Michael grew up there, in the heat and the humidity, in the long summers and the neighborhood basketball courts where children played until the light gave out. He was not, by any early account, obviously extraordinary. He was competitive, ferociously, sometimes irritatingly competitive. But so were his siblings. Competition was simply the Jordan family language. No rivalry shaped Michael more profoundly in those early years than the one he carried with his older brother Larry. Larry Jordan was a year older, physically imposing for his age, and a genuinely gifted basketball player. In the backyard court behind the family home, the two brothers played endless games against each other. Games that were not recreational so much as they were warfare conducted under the cover of sport. Michael lost those games frequently when he was young. Larry was bigger, stronger, more experienced. Michael hated losing. He hated it with a clarity that most children do not feel about anything until they are adults and the stakes of the world have arrived. He would return the next day, and the day after that, working at the specific parts of his game that his brother had exposed, trying to close the gap inch by inch. That gap, in time, would close, and then it would invert entirely. By the time Michael reached Emsley A. Laney High School in Wilmington, he was 15 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, and burning with a desire to play varsity basketball. He tried out for the varsity squad his sophomore year. The cut list went up, and Michael Jordan's name was not on it. He was assigned to the junior varsity team instead. He went home and cried. He has spoken about this moment many times over the decades, with different levels of detail, with the particular editorial shaping that all of us apply to the defining stories of our lives. But the emotional truth is consistent. The rejection devastated him. He had believed he was good enough. The world had told him he was not. He could have accepted that verdict. Most people do. Most people, when a credentialed authority tells them they have reached their ceiling, find ways to make peace with that assessment. Michael Jordan could not do this. He would not do this. He took the cut list as something personal, as a provocation, and he responded the only way he knew how. He went to work. He was in the gymnasium before school. He was there after school. He studied his game with the obsessive rigor of a scientist who suspects there is an error in the experiment, but cannot yet locate it. He played on the JV squad, and he dominated JV competition so thoroughly that the limits of that level became obvious to everyone who watched him. Over the summer before his junior year, Michael Jordan grew 4 inches. He arrived at school in the fall as a 6'3" player with a completely different physical profile and a work ethic that had been forged in the fire of rejection. He made the varsity team. He made it emphatically, and he began, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed, to make clear to anyone paying attention that something unusual was happening. The college recruiters arrived. Among them was Dean Smith, the legendary head coach of the University of North Carolina Tar Heels at Chapel Hill, one of the most respected programs and one of the most respected coaches in the history of American college basketball. Smith saw something in the young man from Wilmington that justified bringing him to Chapel Hill, into a program that had produced NBA players and Olympic athletes. Jordan enrolled in the fall of 1981. His first season at UNC would produce one of the most iconic moments in the history of college basketball. The 1982 NCAA championship game, Georgetown versus North Carolina. 17 seconds remaining. The Tar Heels trailing by 1. Dean Smith drew up the play. the ball found its way to a freshman from Wilmington. Michael Jordan, 18 years old, released a jump shot from the left wing. It went through the net. North Carolina won the national championship, and a legend on that cool March evening began to understand what it was. The 1984 NBA draft was held in June at Madison Square Garden in New York City. It is remembered today primarily for a single decision, one that has become perhaps the most analyzed personnel mistake in the history of professional sports. The Houston Rockets selected Hakeem Olajuwon with the first pick, a generational center whose credentials are beyond dispute. With the second pick, the Portland Trail Blazers chose Sam Bowie, a 7-foot center from Kentucky who had missed 2 full seasons of college due to stress fractures. Bowie's career would be defined by injury. Portland would spend decades understanding what they had passed over. With the third pick, the Chicago Bulls selected Michael Jordan. He arrived in a city that had not given basketball the attention it deserved, on a team that was a genuine afterthought in a market owned by the Bears and the Cubs. Jordan changed this almost immediately. His athleticism was unlike anything the league had seen. The elevation, the hang time, the creativity in the open floor. He won Rookie of the Year in 1985. Then, in only his second season, he broke the navicular tarsal bone in his left foot and missed 64 games. He lobbied the Bulls to let him return early, made it back for the final stretch of the season, and in the first round of the playoffs, against the Boston Celtics, not fully healthy, scored 63 points in a single game. Larry Bird said afterward it was God disguised as Michael Jordan. Even in defeat, Jordan had announced what was coming, but the championships were still far away. For 3 brutal years, the reason was Detroit. The Bad Boy Pistons were constructed around a philosophy that was the deliberate antithesis of everything Jordan represented. Chuck Daly implemented the Jordan rules in 1988, a tactical scheme that amounted to organized punishment. Double him the instant he touches the ball, push him left, make him pay physically for every possession. It worked. Jordan was brilliant and battered, and his teammates were not yet able to absorb the pressure when he was swarmed. Chicago lost to Detroit in the playoffs in 1988, 1989, and 1990. The breakthrough required 2 things: Phil Jackson, who arrived as head coach with the triangle offense, and the philosophical patience to convince Jordan to trust the system, and Scottie Pippen, who had been developing quietly since his 1987 draft into one of the most complete two-way players in the game. Together, Jordan and Pippen became something larger than either could have been alone. In 1991, the Bulls swept past the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals. Detroit's bad boys left the floor without shaking hands, a final act of gracelessness from a team that had run its course. The finals brought Magic Johnson's Los Angeles Lakers. Chicago won in 5 games. Michael Jordan held the trophy and wept. He was 28 years old. He had waited his entire professional life for this, and it arrived with a force that surprised even him. The three-peat followed as though scripted. 1991, 1992, 1993, 3 championships, 3 Finals MVP awards. And then on July 23, 1993, the world fell apart. A man was shot and killed while sleeping in his car on a highway in Lumberton, North Carolina. His name was James Raymond Jordan. He was 56 years old. He was Michael's father. The murder shattered Michael in ways that no opponent or defensive scheme ever had. James had been his closest confidant, his most honest critic, his most faithful audience from the first Cole Gymnasium in Wilmington to the last championship parade in Chicago. 3 months after his father's death, on October 6, 1993, Michael Jordan retired. He was 30 years old. He had nothing left to prove, he said. From the inside, that was the only thing that made sense. Basketball without the man who had loved watching him play, it was a different thing entirely. James Jordan had always talked about Michael trying professional baseball. In early 1994, Jordan reported to spring training with the Chicago White Sox organization and was assigned to their Double-A affiliate, the Birmingham Barons. He wore number 45. He hit .202 and struggled with the curveball. The media turned Birmingham into a circus. He played winter ball in Arizona. He kept working, as he always had, because Michael Jordan did not abandon things before exhausting every available tool. But basketball was calling him back. On March 18, 1995, 2 words went out through his agent. 2 words the sports world received with the stunned joy of an audience discovering the performance had one more act. I'm back. He returned for the final 17 games of the season, wore 45 rather than reclaim 23, as though the years between those numbers had not happened. The Bulls fell to the Orlando Magic in the second round. Nick Anderson stole the ball from Jordan late in a pivotal game, something Anderson publicly noted the number 23 never would have allowed. Jordan took the number back before the following season opened. The second three-peat began. Dennis Rodman arrived in 1996, eccentric, combative, and by many measures the most valuable defensive player of his generation. Jordan was older, smarter, more economical, and had developed a mid-range pull-up jumper of such precision that it operated as a weapon independent of his athleticism. The Bulls won 72 games in 1995 and 96, a record that would stand for 20 years. They won the championship. They won it again in 1997. And on June 14, 1998, in Salt Lake City, the dynasty reached its conclusion with a jump shot and 5 seconds on the clock. 6 championships, 6 Finals MVP awards, a generation defined. On January 13, 1999, Michael Jordan walked to a microphone in Chicago and retired from professional basketball for the second time. Phil Jackson had left the Bulls. Scottie Pippen, compensated unconscionably below his market value for the entirety of the dynasty, was departing for Houston. Dennis Rodman was gone. The team, in the particular and ruthless tradition of professional sports, had been disassembled with almost deliberate speed. Jordan looked at what remained and saw no reason to continue. He spent the next 2 years in various capacities connected to the sport without playing it, as part of the Washington Wizards front office, eventually as their president of basketball operations. And then, in September 2001, at the age of 38, he announced that he was returning to the floor. He would play for the Wizards. He would relinquish his front office role and suit up for a franchise that had not made the playoffs in 8 years. His stated motivation, that he wanted to help grow the sport, that his presence in smaller markets would generate the kind of excitement that benefited the league, was not entirely incorrect. But those who knew him understood that the real motivation was simpler and more elemental. He missed competing. The boardroom could not give him what the game could. He played 2 seasons in Washington, averaging 20 points per game at an age when most players have already been retired for a decade. He made the younger players around him better by the force of his presence and the intimidating clarity of his standards. He also played those 2 seasons on knees and a body that had given everything they had to give across 15 years of the most demanding physical schedule in professional sport. He retired finally and permanently in April 2003, 39 years old, having scored more points in the final years of his career than most players score in their prime. But the most enduring legacy Michael Jordan built was not measured in wins and losses. It was measured in dollars, and what those dollars represented, a fundamental reordering of the relationship between athletes, brands, and the culture at large. In 1984, a 21-year-old rookie signed a 5-year endorsement deal with Nike. The company paid him $500,000 a year, plus royalties, an extraordinary sum at the time, and one that required significant internal debate at Nike, which was primarily a running company and had only a tentative foothold in basketball. The arrangement produced the Air Jordan the Frumfruss, a shoe in Bulls red and black that violated the NBA's uniform regulations and cost Jordan a $5,000 fine every time he wore it during a game. Nike paid the fines cheerfully. The controversy was free advertising of incalculable value. The Air Jordan line grew with each passing year. Each new model was a cultural event. Children lined up outside shoe stores in ways that had previously been reserved for concerts and film premieres. The Jordan brand, eventually spun out as its own division within Nike, became something larger than a shoe company. It became a mythology, a status marker, an entire visual language about aspiration and excellence. Today, decades after Michael Jordan last laced up a pair of sneakers as an active NBA player, the Jordan brand generates more than $5 billion in annual revenue. His royalty arrangement makes him, in most years, more money than he ever earned playing basketball. Beyond Nike, there were other ventures, other interests, other accumulations. In 2010, Jordan became the majority owner of the Charlotte Bobcats, later rebranded as the Charlotte Hornets, making him the first former NBA player to hold a majority ownership stake in a league franchise. His net worth, built across endorsements and investments and business interests and the relentless appreciation of an icon's commercial value, now exceeds $3 billion. The boy from Wilmington, the son of a factory worker and a bank teller, became a billionaire. Not through basketball, ultimately, but through the gravitational pull that basketball at its highest level created around his name. What the numbers cannot capture is the texture of who Jordan was as a competitor, the stories that leaked out over the years from teammates, opponents, coaches, anyone who encountered him in proximity to a court. He was, by nearly universal account, a force that was not entirely comfortable to exist near. He trash-talked with a creativity and persistence that crossed on many occasions into something more like psychological warfare. He held his teammates to the standards he held himself, and his standards were inhuman. He screamed at Scottie Pippen in practice. He once punched Steve Kerr in the face during a training camp drill and had to apologize the next day. He drove everyone around him past the point where driving should have been possible. He also gambled, a fact that became public knowledge in the 1990s and generated significant controversy, including a whispered theory, never substantiated, that his first retirement had been a quiet suspension rather than a voluntary departure. Jordan himself addressed the subject in The Last Dance, the 10-part documentary released in 2020 that granted the world unprecedented access to the footage and the memories of the dynasty years. He acknowledged that he had a competitive problem that extended to gambling, that the same pathology that made him the best basketball player on the planet also made it impossible for him to walk past any form of competition without engaging it at the maximum level available to him. The Last Dance arrived during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world was starved for communal experience, and found one in the story of a team and a man that many people had lived through in real time and others were encountering for the first time. It drew audiences that no sports documentary had previously reached. It reintroduced Michael Jordan to a generation that had grown up after his playing days and introduced him, for the first time, to a generation after that. And it confirmed, with the specificity and intimacy of real footage, what the legend had always suggested, that there was no one like him, that there may never be anyone like him, and that the particular combination of gifts and pathologies and tragedies and obsessions that made him who he was might be, in the final accounting, unrepeatable. There is a version of the Michael Jordan story that is simple and triumphant, the version that begins with the cut list at Laney High School and ends with 6 fingers raised at the Delta Center, and reads, in the space between those 2 moments, as a clean parable about believing in yourself when others do not. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The fuller version contains a boy whose relationship with failure was not healthy or balanced, but rather consuming and obsessive, who could not set down a slight, who could not release a defeat, who carried every dismissal and every loss as fuel for something that his competitors could not access because they had moved on, as reasonable people do, while Michael Jordan had not. His genius was inseparable from his pathology. The competitiveness that made him unstoppable also made him, at times, unbearable. These facts do not cancel each other out. They exist together, as they do in most people who achieve things the world has not previously seen. The lesson of rejection is not that rejection is secretly a gift, a comforting fiction that strips the sting from a real wound. The lesson is that what you do in the days after rejection determines more about your future than the rejection itself ever could. Michael Jordan was cut from a team. The cut was real. It hurt, genuinely and deeply, in the way that public failure hurts a young person who has invested their identity in a dream. He did not pretend it didn't hurt. He went home and felt it. And then he went to the gymnasium and did something about it. The lesson of his father's death is harder and more important and less often spoken about. James Jordan's murder did not make Michael stronger. It did not secretly contribute to a second act that was more magnificent than the first would have been without tragedy. It broke him. He has said as much. He walked away from the thing he loved because the person who most loved watching him do it was gone, and the thing therefore felt different in a way that words could not adequately describe. He spent a year and a half in a minor league baseball uniform, not as a calculated move, but as a man in grief doing the thing his father had always wanted to see him try. Resilience, in the Jordan story, is not the absence of devastation. It is the fact that devastation, eventually, was not the final word. He came back. He came back because he was a basketball player in the deepest cellular sense, and because the game was still there, and because the competitor inside him, the one who cried after the cut list and then went to the gym the next morning, could not be quieted permanently by even the most unimaginable grief. The lesson of his competitive obsession is perhaps the most transferable for those of us who will never play a professional sport, will never feel the particular pressure of a championship game in our bones. Jordan demanded more from himself than any external authority ever required of him. The coaches set standards, and he exceeded them. The league imposed rules, and he worked within them while making them irrelevant through sheer performance. The competition studied him, and he studied back, and then he found ways to beat them that they had not anticipated, because he was always in the gymnasium when they were somewhere else. Greatness, in this telling, is not a destination. It is a practice, daily, grinding, unglamorous, conducted in empty gymnasiums before dawn and after midnight, in film rooms and weight rooms, and in the countless invisible hours between the performances the world sees. Michael Jordan understood this before most people have the experience to understand anything, and he maintained that understanding across 15 years of professional basketball, across 2 retirements, across grief and controversy, and the particular burden of being expected every single night to be the greatest player on the floor. He was. More often than not, he was. The 6 rings are there, the numbers are there, the footage is there, the hang time, the tongue, the final shot in Salt Lake City. But what endures beyond all of it is something harder to film and harder to quantify. The image of a 15-year-old boy walking home from the gymnasium in Wilmington, North Carolina, having just seen his name absent from a list, deciding, in whatever wordless way such decisions are made, that this was not the end of his story, that it was, in fact, only the beginning. Whatever you have been told you cannot do, whatever list your name has failed to appear on, whatever door has closed in your face, whatever verdict has been delivered by people who could not see what you saw in yourself, the gymnasium is open. The work is waiting. The question that Michael Jordan answered across an entire lifetime, in every context and at every level, is the same question that waits for all of us in the morning. What are you going to do with this? This has been Visionary Chronicles.